What's going on, guys? Onai here, and today I'm going to be doing a Jaden McNeil-esque ramble on my opinion on which 2x2 subset that people should learn first. So, for full disclosure, I am not a world-class solver by any means. If you look at my WCA profile, I have a 2.45 official average, which was even then a fair bit better than what I average now, and don't have hardly any sub 2 official singles. So there's going to be people that know way more about this than I do, or just know more about 2x2 in general than I do, and might have a differing opinion. But that being said, let's get on into it. So there's 3 but kind of 4-ish subsets, or technically if you really wanted to count it 2 to 4, depending on what your definition of a subset is, that people tend to use realistically in solves. First one is CLL, where you have a full layer on the bottom and you solve the rest in one alg. The second one is EG1, where you have a not a layer but a face with a bar. Put that bar in the back and solve the rest in one alg. And here's kind of where you will have a differing thing on what people actually use depending on how much they care about 2x2. If you don't really care too much about 2x2, but you've already learned at least CLL, then you can do anti-CLL here, which essentially you force a diagonal swap on top when you have a diagonal swap on bottom. And if you're like me and care a bit too much about 2x2, you can just use a dedicated EG2 alg. Like that. So, what are the pros of each of these subsets? And I'll get to these two in a minute. What are the pros? The pros of CLL. The algs are really good. As you noticed before, for this case that I did, it's a very spammy RUF. And then another pro is you're going to be using algs, a lot of algs that you already know. So take, for example, this case. You can recognize it by these two being opposite and these two being opposite. And the alg for this, soon, 7-move CLL. Easy. And if you, let's see how I set this up. Yeah, okay. And let me set that up on a 3x3. All right, so if you know full OLL, depending on the alg you use, you also know this case, where if you were to just, it's a soon case that gives you a diagonal swap. But if you know CLL, or if you know full OLL, you will know this case, where it's kind of this pattern on top, this bar right here, put the bar in the back, and solve it like that. This is the same alg. So a lot, and there's a fair bit of cases like that. Too many to go into, but if you decide to learn CLL and you know full OLL, there will be a fair bit of carryover. And the cons, honestly, not too many. But if you're going to learn more subsets and trying to decide which one to do first or to learn first, which is why you're watching this video, and depending on the method that you go from later on, I'll explain more on this, it can be very restricting. So if you say use Ortega and are, I want to say average, low-ish 4, possibly sub 4, depending on what your recognition speed is, you're going to be very, 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 very comfortable with only making a face. And going from making a face to a full layer is so much more restrictive. So, depending on the method that you use, it can be tricky to go back to that. Pros of EG1. As mentioned before, if you're coming from Ortega and are fairly proficient with making faces instead of layers, You know what that means? 2/3 of the time, and little hand scramble, 2/3 of the time, you are going to get this case. You're essentially a bar on the bottom, or a adjacent swap on the bottom. So 2/3 of the time, that gives you a lot more practice with it, first of all, and you don't have to be as restricted to going back to a full layer. Cons. There are no algs at all that transfer over. So pure soon or solve soon, yeah, you're not going to be able to use any of those if you decide to learn EG1. So there's going to be more algs to just straight up learn that you've never seen before. But you'll also get cases like this, literally the best EG1 case. It's not the most common, but if you get it, if you learn any EG1 algs, learn this one. Easy as that. Pros of CLL or anti-CLL and or EG2. Anti-CLL, if you already know CLL, you don't have to learn any more algs. You'll have to just learn the cases on how, or you'll just have to learn the cases that lead to an adjacent swap on top. And as far as EG2, it's the same kind of freedom of making a face versus layer, but having a diag swap on bottom has the same probability of making or having a full layer just from making a face. So in that sense, I really don't think EG2 or anti-CLL, given the names, you should not learn this first. Just my opinion on that. It is, if you care about 2x2, learn it, obviously, but it shouldn't be first. So let's go back into let's go into where you're coming from in, where you're coming from as far as a beginner or intermediate method. So if we go back to these, if you are coming from LBL or layer by layer, some kind of beginner's method, then you can already get sub 3 averages like this, just with that method alone. You don't necessarily need anything super fancy, just good recognition. And when you're pretty good at recognizing corner patterns on even just 3x3 for going into last layer, depending on your alg, you can say, so like this, even though this is Niklas, if you were to just do normal soon here, you can say, oh, this doesn't lead to a solved or diagonal corner swap on top. So I'll just do soon and go straight into PLL. Just knowing that you're going to have an adjacent swap, which again happens 2/3 of the time if you just do a it just happens 2/3 of the time if you just do normal last layer alg. And if you're coming from Ortega with the same case, or similar case, so you know, or if you're familiar enough with it, you can be like, oh, this case does not lead to an adjacent or solved case, so you know you're going to have a bar in the back and bar on top. So you can just go right into your PBO, which happens most of the time. I don't think it's 2/3, just because there's, I guess, a total of 6 PBL cases if you count solved. 5 or 6, something like that. And then, same thing with Ortega. If you haven't diagonal swap on the bottom, you can just use the same recognition and same techniques. Gotta look at my notes. And also, going into why you shouldn't learn anti-CLL or EG2 is when you're making a face or a layer, or just a face in general, and you see that you're going to get a diagonal swap on bottom, what you can do is just, before you just fully make the face, you can cancel into like an R2 F to R2 and get a CLL case like that. So just another reason why you don't need to learn anti-CLL or EG2 first. So with all that being said, which one did I learn first? Well, I learned EG1 first. Just given the fact that I was already averaging, like, I want to say 4.1 with Ortega, and I started looking into CLL, and because I had a feeling that a fair bit of the algs that I used for Olo already transferred over, so I was like, okay, let's see about going back to making a layer, and it was awful. Coming from Ortega, and if you're proficient with it, definitely learn EG1 first. If you're not super familiar with, or not familiar, if you're not the most comfortable with Ortega and are coming from something like LBL or beginners and just want to go for it, and you're already used to making a layer instead of a face, go for CLL. Less to learn, and you can cancel into like R2 F to R2 or R2 B2 or something. If you have a diagonal swap on bottom, you can cancel into that and just get enforce a CLL every single time. But as mentioned before, it's going to be more restrictive. So there's a few nuances. I don't think there's one correct answer, except not EG2. So I guess that is really my thoughts and takeaway. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that, and hope to see you guys at future competitions. Good luck. Happy cubing.